I'm your host, Anna, and welcome to a brand new episode of Coffee Chats on the Crime Bistro podcast. Today, it is all about polygraph tests. Now, true crime has been a part of the media and the entertainment industry for a very long time, and polygraph tests have been a huge part of some of the most dramatic moments that you will ever see on a crime drama or a TV show. Think about the steely examiner, the terrified subject, the pen dragging across the paper, recording heart rate and breathing changes with every new question. But what actually are they? And do they even work? Not to mention, what should we think when we hear that a suspect has failed or passed a polygraph in real life? When they deny taking one, what could that mean? It is a huge part of true crime, and it's a subject that was so fascinating to look into, so I am really excited to dive into this episode today. But before we do, right now I am having a cherry slush Alani Nu, and I don't want to hear it. I know that's a lot of caffeine. I really don't care. It's been a long day/week, but this episode is perfectly paired with your own coffee, caffeinated beverage, or emotional support water bottle. So if you haven't already, go ahead and grab that and let's get into Coffee Chats. What on earth is a polygraph test? I do want to start by giving a little bit of background on polygraph tests just to give some context to this whole conversation here. Polygraph tests have become a little bit of a cultural icon. It's kind of, like I said, the pinnacle of a dramatic moment on like any crime show. And the moment someone gets hooked up to that thing, it's like gasps everywhere. But their history actually goes back much further than I thought it did, so let's get into it because it's really interesting. The first polygraph was created in 1921 by John A. Larson. He was a police officer and physiologist from California. The device that he created was able to measure continuous changes in blood pressure, in heart rate, and in respiration to aid investigators in detecting deception. His work in 1921 was actually inspired by an Italian psychologist whose name was Vittorio Benussi, who in 1914 published his own findings on the respiratory symptoms of lying. John Larson also did take some inspiration from somebody named William M. Marston. He was an American psychologist and lawyer who invented the discontinuous systolic blood pressure test for the detection of deception in 1915. Say that 5 times fast. So John Larson combined these two ideologies into the polygraph test in 1921, and it would first be used in the legal system in the year 1923. In 1923, William Marston, the lawyer who invented the discontinuous blood pressure test, attempted to have the results of a polygraph admitted into evidence in the case U.S. versus Fry. The court did reject the results of the polygraph, stating, quote, "While courts will go a long way in admitting experimental testimony deduced from a well-recognized scientific principle or discovery, the thing from which the deduction is made must be sufficiently established to have gained general acceptance in the particular field in which it belongs." That was a lot of words. So essentially, the court basically ruled that there wasn't enough evidence that the polygraph worked, and it wasn't well established as something that was like scientific in general to be used as evidence in a court case. This decision by the court would come to be known as the Fry Standard, and it did establish the standard of not allowing polygraph tests into court proceedings. So let's go back to John Larson, who was the inventor of the first polygraph. He pioneered most of the early research on the polygraph test while he was working for the Berkeley... I almost just said Canada. I put CA as the abbreviation, and I almost said Canada. Let's start that over. He pioneered most of the early research on the polygraph test while he was working for the Berkeley, California Police Department in the 1920s. During this time, John Larson was working with a man named Leonard Keeler, who was also a major driver of developments to the polygraph test. Leonard Keeler made the polygraph instrument portable, and he also added the galvanic skin response, or GSR, to the polygraph in 1938. GSR basically refers to measuring changes in skin conductivity during the polygraph test, and because Leonard added this element to the test, he was able to patent his own polygraph. But he did not stop there. Leonard Keeler actually also established his own polygraph school. Keeler and John Larson had been using a technique of questioning a subject during the polygraph test that was known as the relevant-irrelevant question technique. After Keeler passed away in 1949, research into the polygraph was still ongoing, and the research would be picked up by a man named John Reed. John Reed would also go on to start his own polygraph school, and he would also develop a new questioning technique, which today is referred to as the CQT, and is now the most widely used technique among polygraph examiners. Don't worry, we are going to get into this technique later. But from the beginning, as we saw with the Frye standard, there were major issues with the validity of polygraphs in general. But the first empirical review of the polygraph wasn't conducted until 1965, and the conclusion of this study was that, quote, "There is no lie detector, neither man nor machine. People have been deceived by a myth that a metal box in the hands of an investigator can detect truth or falsehood," end quote. We will continue to talk about the issues with admissibility and with accuracy regarding the polygraph tests soon, but I don't want to continue with that until we actually go over the machine itself and how it works, because that is kind of important here. So, let's take a regular polygraph test. How does it work? The polygraph test is kind of complicated and also kind of simple at the same time. So the instrument that is typically used in a polygraph test consists of a physiological recorder. Essentially what it does is measures 3 indicators of autonomic arousal, and autonomic here is just referring to any sort of physiological change that happens within our nervous system that is out of our control. The polygraph test measures a person's heart rate/blood pressure, their respiration, and their skin conductivity. In terms of the heart rate and blood pressure changes, all cardiovascular activity is assessed using a blood pressure cuff. In terms of the respiration, the test measures both the rate of a person's respiration and the depth of their respiration, both of which are measured by pneumographs that are placed around a person's chest. And if you're not familiar, the term pneumo pretty much refers to anything that has to do with your lungs, like pneumothorax, so that's why this is measured on the chest. Skin conductivity is also known as the galvanic skin or electrodermal response, and that itself is measured through electrodes that are attached to the subject's fingertips. When it was first developed, the machine used a pen that would write in ink onto a roll of paper to record the physiological changes that were being picked up by the measuring devices. Today, these measurements are taken digitally and are recorded directly from those measuring instruments. So that's kind of the physiological side of polygraph tests, and that should have given you a pretty good idea of where the actual concept of lie detector came from. But they still need to be able to use the instrument in practice, so let's go over how exactly these tests work and what happens during an examination. The recording instrument itself, as well as the questioning techniques, are only used as a part of the examination. This is in part so that the subject will not be familiar with the test or with the testing techniques that are used to administer the test, so that they won't be able to manipulate the examiner. Generally, the examination will start with a pre-testing phase where the technique of the test is explained to the subject and each test question is reviewed. At this stage, the questions and the procedure are clearly explained to the subject so that the examiner can ensure that they understand all of the questions. And on a more psychological level, this is also to induce a subject's concern about being deceptive. This kind of pre-testing phase is really interesting, actually. It's almost like taking advantage of confirmation bias. Like the examiner is talking to the subject about the test, and they're acting as the expert and as the professional in this setting. So the more that the subject thinks of the examiner as an expert, the less likely they will be to lie, because they think that the expert is going to be able to catch every lie. And now that I've said it out loud, I don't really think that's confirmation bias, but it's still a really fascinating tactic. Anyways, the polygraph test will also usually include a procedure that's called a stimulation test, which is basically a demonstration in the instrument's accuracy in detecting deception. This is another tactic which can discourage the subject from lying, but it can also increase the subject's anxiety about lying, which would lead to a more profound physiological change, and it would mean that a lie would be much easier detected on the test. There are several different questioning techniques that are usually used in polygraphs, but the most widely used for criminal investigations is the control question test, or the CQT. The CQT works by comparing responses to questions that are relevant to the investigation with the responses to control questions. Control questions are specifically designed to control for the effect of the generally threatening nature of relevant questions. In other words, the control question should cause little to no reaction in the subject, making it very clear to see when a relevant question does show a major physiological reaction. The examiner is basically looking for a pattern between the responses to the two different types of questions. They're looking for greater responses to the relevant questions, and that will, in theory, show the deception. What I did find really interesting, however, is that if they don't find a difference between the relevant and the control questions in terms of the actual reaction that they cause, the test is ruled inconclusive. So the only options with this technique are deception or inconclusive, and there's no option for non-deceptive or not lying. Like I said, though, there are multiple different techniques of testing, and an alternative procedure to the CQT is called the Guilty Knowledge Test, or GKT. This test in particular is different because it involves creating multiple choice questions, with the answer to those questions being something that only a guilty person could know. An example would be like if someone were accused of committing fraud, the examiner could ask if the total amount was $500, $1,000, or $1,500, and then the subject would answer by choosing one of those options that were given. The logic behind this type of testing is that if a guilty person knows which answer is actually right, they will have a large physiological reaction to choosing that answer, and if they didn't know, their reaction would be relatively indifferent. This method is not widely used since it does require a larger number of questions to be able to make a psychometrically sound evaluation, as well as the fact that a guilty subject's reactions would be pretty difficult to interpret if they didn't choose the right answer on purpose. They might have a physiological reaction, but it would be really difficult to accurately judge that. Another reason that this technique is not used very often is because it can really only be used when investigators have information that only the guilty person would know. This does happen, and police will often hide important details from the press and from the public for a situation exactly like this with a suspect, but I can't imagine that it's generally enough information to be able to put together an entire examination with enough data to make a determination. So, as I'm sure you can assume, because of the nature of the polygraph test, it has raised a lot of questions and a lot of concerns about its validity by experts, and for really good reason, too. The polygraph test, as we just talked about, is based entirely on your uncontrollable physiological responses to different questions. So often when it's being used in criminal investigations, it's being used to determine the legitimacy of someone's story and to confirm or deny whether they are lying about their role in a crime, which raises a clear issue because during the questioning process, things are inevitably going to come up that will cause an emotional reaction in the subject. To best explain my point here, I'm just going to give an example of what I'm trying to get at, but this example is completely made up and I am not a psychologist, so take it with a grain of salt, please. So let's assume that a polygraph examination is being used in a murder investigation. For the sake of the example, let's pretend that there's a husband and a wife who have been arguing and are near divorce. One night they get into another argument, and while they're arguing, the husband trips, falls down the stairs, and he dies. Morbid, I know, stick with me here. So the wife goes to the police station for questioning, and they don't believe her story that he slipped at the top of the stairs. They think that she pushed him. So they ask her to take a polygraph test. They'll start with the normal questions to set a baseline, and then they start to ask her about her husband. Now, she's expecting them to ask her only about the accident that killed him, but instead they ask her why she and her husband had been fighting and if she had wanted to divorce him. Not only would this woman be shocked that the police knew that her marriage had been on thin ice, she also would realize in that moment that they actually thought she killed her husband. They weren't just doing their due diligence, they were trying to charge her with murder. Even though she is completely innocent and this was truly just a horrible accident, the question itself did spark an emotional reaction in her, and the police thought she was lying, even though she was telling the truth the whole time. Do you kind of see what I'm getting at here? Like, in a sensitive situation and in a sensitive case, someone would likely be having physiological reactions to the process of the test and to the questions that were being asked. This could severely affect the results, and even though they weren't lying, their emotions had just been triggered by something the examiner said. It does raise a serious issue because if someone is innocent in a murder case, for example, and they have an emotional reaction to the name of the victim, who might have been somebody that they really loved, this person could be labeled as deceptive, even though the emotional reaction should actually have just told police that they were deeply upset by the crime and by the loss. What I'm saying really is that it can severely skew the opinions of police as well as the opinions of prosecutors and lawyers. Not to mention because most people have only seen polygraph tests in the media and in crime movies or shows, most people don't actually know about the issues with their accuracy, and a shocking number of people don't know that polygraphs are not allowed in court. So if the media reports that a suspect has failed their polygraph test, they could potentially be condemned immediately in the court of public opinion, which we all know can legitimately make a big difference in cases. But that's just what I'm saying, so let's go over what the actual experts are saying about polygraph tests. In 1991, a psychologist named Leonard Sachs argued an excellent point that I think really encompasses the issues with polygraph tests. He expressed the idea that being able to detect a person's veracity by monitoring psychophysiological changes is more myth than it is reality. He also said that even the phrase itself, lie detector, is a misnomer because lie detection assumes that the examiner is inferring deception through analysis of physiological responses to a structured but not standard series of questions, which I do want to add does bring up a whole other set of issues because there is no standard method and there's no standard set of questions or number of questions, etc. On top of that, the questions and the method are left up to the individual examiner, which means that the results can oftentimes be attributed more to the examiner than to the test itself. So let's discuss this in a little bit more detail, the idea that the examiner has a huge impact on results and how the results are interpreted. Starting with the blood pressure and cardiovascular measurements that are taken, you need an examiner who is aware of how perceived threats, increased mental activity, and general arousal can affect the results. But this can even be taken a step further. Individuals with mental illness or anxiety disorders, or even just the circumstances in which the test is administered, can severely sway the results of the test. Examiners are assuming that certain patterns of cardiovascular activity are characteristic of deception or of truth across a wide variety of individuals, and they're not necessarily taking into account these individual differences. Respiratory activity deepens this issue with the measurements because it is impacted by both the autonomic nervous system as well as the central nervous system, which basically means that it can be changed either voluntarily or involuntarily, but the examiner has no way to know what system is at work when these changes are occurring. Changes in skin conductivity are thought to be the most reliable metric in the test. However, it should be noted that this can depend on the individual as well. Sudden changes in skin conductivity can occur in the absence of any stimulus, and the examiner would have no way of knowing that the change that they're recording is simply a spontaneous physiological event. The other thing that has been brought up in terms of the examiners is that they can have their own bias about the subject, about the person in front of them, which can also potentially change the results of the test. Another big issue with polygraph tests is that they are almost an entirely theoretical practice, which means that there is a lot of conflicting information out there about the tests themselves. For example, there are honest people who might just be nervous while they're answering questions truthfully, while at the same time there are also liars who would not be nervous when answering questions deceptively. And because there is no evidence of these physiological reactions being unique to deception, there would be no accurate way to discern if someone was nervous or if they were lying. Another issue that experts have with the polygraph test is based on the same idea that this is a theoretical practice. While it may be true that examiners cannot tell the difference between nervousness and lies, some studies have shown that polygraphs can be very accurate in detecting lies, and it's hard to just discount some of these studies because they can be good studies. So the same psychologist who I had just mentioned earlier, Leonard Sachs, said in 1999, quote, "It may in fact be impossible to conduct a proper validity study." So we've gotten to an interesting subject in the whole issue of polygraph tests. If everything that we've talked about so far is true, how are there studies that have shown that polygraph tests are accurate and valid? Good question. I was wondering the same thing, but there is actually a pretty good theory regarding this. This theory is that the placebo effect makes a big difference on how a subject acts during their examination. So if the subject themselves wholeheartedly believes that the test is accurate, they will either confess because they don't think that they can lie, or they will have a major reaction to telling a lie because they're worried that they're going to get caught. So it's possible that during studies that have been conducted, the subjects have convinced themselves that the polygraph is legitimate, and they've been afraid to lie for fear of the accuracy of the polygraph exposing them. Thus, experts argue that some studies may appear to be accurate, but may actually be inaccurate because the polygraph was not measuring deception. Instead, it was measuring the fear levels of the subjects. And then to this point as well, most of what we've talked about today has had to do with the instrument of the polygraph itself, but there are a lot of people who argue against polygraphs, arguing that it's really easy for someone to just trick the test. And based on all of the information that's available about polygraph tests and how they work, it would be kind of easy for someone to figure out how to outsmart their examiner. So where does this all kind of leave us today? Like I mentioned, most courts do not allow any kind of polygraph tests to be allowed into evidence, and most psychologists and scientists agree that there is very little evidence that they offer valid results. And by the way, when I say court, I don't just mean any court. I mean the court case of U.S. versus Sheffer in 1998 determined that polygraph results are not valid evidence. U.S. v. Sheffer was a case based on Military Rule of Evidence 707, which states that excluding the admission of polygraph results into evidence in a trial does not violate the defendant's Sixth Amendment right to present a fair defense. In an 8-1 vote, the Supreme Court decided that the Rule of Evidence 707 was consistent with the legitimate interest of state and federal authorities to admit only reliable evidence, essentially saying that polygraphs could not be admitted as reliable evidence. The court also emphasized the poor reliability of polygraph tests as a whole, noting that the jury was the ultimate evaluator of credibility and not the lie detector instrument. The development of the polygraph test as we know it today has been largely based on very general ideas about physiological functioning, but most of these technologies for lie detection have not been supported by systemic physiological research. The original idea for lie detection technology was based on the idea that deception required effort and then would have to show a major physiological reaction. However, this has not proved to be true, not to mention that there is very limited research on deceptiveness in general, and we need a much greater understanding of the mechanisms of how deceptiveness manifests itself physically through involuntary reactions within the body. Without that understanding, it's like trying to solve for x in the equation when you don't have an answer to balance the equation with. Hopefully that makes sense. It's basing a conclusion about whether someone is lying off of the validity of a theoretical process that has not been proven to be true, which is actually, when you think about it, really bizarre. All right, so that is the majority of the scientific information that I'm going to throw at you in this one, but hopefully you feel like you have a better understanding of polygraph tests, like how they work, what their limitations are, and what the implications of a test can actually be. The reason that I'm making this episode is because there are a lot of people with very strong feelings about polygraphs, and there's a lot of misinformation about them out there. So what exactly is the implication here? Essentially, just don't believe everything you hear. If someone fails a polygraph, that does not mean they are guilty, and if they pass, that also does not mean that they are innocent. We need to take the polygraph results at face value for what they are, which is an unproved scientific technique that is not supported by courts or by legal systems. And if you ever do find yourself in a situation where you are being asked to take a lie detector test, keep these things in mind because they can do a lot more harm than good. It's always important to talk to your lawyer first, not me, don't listen to me, but the test can impede your right to avoid self-incrimination, and just know that there is no circumstance in which a law enforcement agency can force you to take a polygraph. Because it has not been proven as a valid technique to show deception, you do not have to take a polygraph. So if you do see in a case that someone has refused to take a polygraph, don't assume that means that this person is guilty. Actually, just assume that they probably just have a really good lawyer who is looking out for their best interest in avoiding the test altogether. That way, there won't even need to be a discussion about whether or not it should be presented to a jury. But all that notwithstanding, I am dying to know your thoughts. If you've made it to the end of this episode, what surprised you about polygraph tests? Would you take one? Do you think that they should even exist? All important questions since they are very prevalent in the world of true crime, and I would love to know if this information has at all changed your opinion about the whole thing. Let me know. You can comment on YouTube. You can also comment on Spotify, which is pretty cool, or you can send me an email right through the Crime Bistro website. And in the meantime, you can also keep up with the podcast on TikTok during the week for some additional content and some crazy stories and a little bit more like true to, what am I trying to say? It's a little bit more up to date? True to time? What? I don't know. Whatever. Forget I said anything. Follow me on TikTok. It's a lot of fun over there. With that being said, if you are still here, I appreciate you. I appreciate your time. And I hope that you find this subject as interesting as I did. And with all of that, thank you again. And this episode is going to be coming to a close. So we'll end here. As always, until next time.